My name is Madison, and if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever poured your entire soul into something only to have it thrown back in your face, then you need to hear my story. For 5 years, the grand, cold walls of the Harrison estate were my home. I wasn't family, not by blood, but I was the one who was there. I was the one raising their children, Leo and Clara, while their parents, Richard and Eleanor Harrison, were collecting passport stamps and living a life I could only see in the glossy magazines on their coffee table. I was the live-in nanny, a title that felt insultingly simple for what I actually did. I was the kisser of scraped knees, the chaser of bedtime monsters, the keeper of secrets, the steady, beating heart in a house that was often just an empty, beautiful shell. I loved those children with a fierceness that still aches in my chest. I think, in her own twisted way, their mother Eleanor knew that. She counted on it. And in the end, she used that love as the weapon to cast me out, leaving me devastated and homeless on the side of a road I had once considered part of my own life. It all came to a head on a Tuesday, a ridiculously normal sunny Tuesday in June. Richard was in Singapore, closing some multi-million-dollar deal, and Eleanor was preparing for a charity luncheon she was hosting that weekend. The house was humming with that specific brand of controlled chaos that precedes a major social event. Florists were arranging towering vases of lilies that made the air thick and cloying, and caterers were clanging pots in the cavernous kitchen. I was in the nursery with 7-year-old Clara, building a ridiculously complex castle out of magnetic tiles. Leo, who was 10, was at a friend's house. It was a peaceful moment in the middle of the storm, the kind of moment that had become the entire foundation of my life. And then Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her usual costume of breezy linen or silk. She was in a severe-looking gray dress, her arms crossed, her face a mask of theatrical distress. The air in the room went from warm and playful to ice-cold in a second. Clara, sensing it immediately, stopped what she was doing and looked from her mother's face to mine. Eleanor didn't even glance at her daughter. Her eyes were locked on me. She said, her voice dripping with a poison, "I knew all too well, Madison, I need to speak with you. In my study, now." The walk down the long, sun-drenched hallway felt like a mile. Her heels clicked in angry rhythm on the polished oak floors. I remember thinking how strange it was, how a place that had felt like my sanctuary for half a decade could suddenly feel like enemy territory. In her study, a room of dark wood and leather that always smelled faintly of her husband's forgotten cigars, she closed the door behind us. She got straight to it. "My sapphire and diamond necklace is missing," she said. "The one my grandmother left me. I had it in my jewelry box this morning, and now it is gone." I just stared at her, completely bewildered. My mind was racing. Had it been misplaced? Did one of the temporary catering staff? I opened my mouth to suggest we look for it, to retrace her steps, but she cut me off. "Don't play dumb with me, Madison. You were in my bedroom this morning to get my breakfast tray. No one else has been in there." The accusation hung in the air, so ludicrous, so utterly disconnected from reality, that I almost laughed. Me, I was the one who had found her misplaced wedding ring in a coat pocket a year ago. I was the one who reminded her of her own mother's birthday. Stealing was not in my nature, and she knew it. The necklace was famous in the family, worth more than I would make in 10 years. The idea was absurd. "Eleanor," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I would never, you know I would never do that. Let's just look for it. I can help you search the room." Her expression hardened. It was a look I'd seen before, but never directed at me with such venom. It was the look she gave a waiter who brought the wrong wine, or a gardener who had the audacity to let a single weed sprout in her perfect rose beds. It was a look of utter dismissive contempt. "The search is over. Your things will be packed. I want you out of this house in 1 hour. An hour. 5 years of my life, the lives of 2 children I adored, erased in 1 hour." The injustice of it was like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I felt my knees go weak. "But why? Why would you think this?" "Because," she hissed, leaning across her massive desk, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I know people like you. You see what we have, and you get greedy. You think you're entitled to it. You think because you play mother to my children, you're somehow one of us. You're not. You are the help, and the help is replaceable." But it wasn't about the necklace. I knew that in my gut. It was about Julian, the handsome, brooding landscape architect, who had been working on the estate for the past 6 months. It was about the way Eleanor's eyes followed him when he was working near the pool. It was about the hushed conversation I had accidentally walked in on in the conservatory a week earlier, a conversation that stopped abruptly and left a lingering charge of guilt in the air. It was about the fact that Richard was due home in 3 days. She was terrified, I knew. She was terrified I would say something, that my loyalty to the children and the family as a whole would extend to its patriarch. She wasn't just firing me, she was preemptively silencing me. She was getting rid of a witness. She looked at me, her eyes daring me to say his name, to call her bluff. But I was too stunned, too broken. The accusation of theft was so shocking, it had completely disarmed me. I just shook my head, tears blurring the image of her smug, triumphant face. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say. I turned and walked out of the study, my whole body trembling. I felt the eyes of Maria, the housekeeper, on me as I passed through the hall. Her face was a portrait of pity and fear. She knew, of course she knew. She saw everything in that house. But like me, she was powerless. I packed a single pathetic box of my belongings from my small room in the staff wing. A few books, some clothes, a framed photo of Leo and Clara building a snowman in the backyard. I could hear Clara crying in the nursery, asking for me. It was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. Eleanor wouldn't even let me say goodbye. A security guard I'd never seen before escorted me to the front door, as if I were a common criminal. As he closed the massive carved oak door behind me, the finality of the sound echoed in the empty space where my life used to be. I was devastated, I was heartbroken, and I was homeless. But Eleanor Harrison, in her rush to dispose of me, had made one single colossal mistake. She didn't realize that in my last sweep of the nursery, a room I knew better than my own skin, I'd found her darkest secret, not in a diary, not on a laptop, but hidden away like a child's forgotten toy. She wanted me gone before I could tell her husband about her affair. She had no idea that I was about to tell the whole world about so much more. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. At that moment it was about survival, but revenge has a funny way of finding you when you've been pushed too far. The first 24 hours were a blur of cheap motel disinfectant and the kind of existential dread that settles deep in your bones. I sat on the edge of a lumpy bed, the garish floral comforter scratching my arms, and just stared at the wall. The single box of my life sat by the door. Every time a car pulled into the motel parking lot, my heart would leap with a stupid, desperate hope that it was them, that it was Richard Harrison's black sedan, that there had been a terrible mistake, that Eleanor had found her necklace and was coming to apologize. But the cars always passed. The silence in that room was deafening, a stark contrast to the constant happy chaos of life with Leo and Clara. I could almost feel the phantom weight of Clara's head on my lap as we read stories, or hear Leo's excited chatter about his latest Lego creation. The loss was a physical amputation. They had cut a part of me away, and I didn't know how to stop the bleeding. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut. I replayed the scene in the study over and over, my mind grasping for the right words, the perfect defense I'd been too shocked to deliver. I should have screamed. I should have called her a liar. I should have marched to the jewelry box myself and torn her room apart until the necklace appeared. But I had been paralyzed by the sheer injustice of it. Eleanor had counted on that. She knew that good, honest people are often the most defenseless against a truly brazen lie. Their decency becomes a cage. When the sun came up, casting a dirty yellow light through the thin motel curtains, the grief began to curdle into something else, something harder, something colder, anger. A slow-burning rage began to thaw the frozen shock in my veins. How dare she build her perfect life on my back, on my love for her children, and then discard me like a piece of trash the second I became inconvenient. That's when the memories started to flood in, not as wistful daydreams, but as evidence. I was building a case in the court of my own mind. I remembered the first day I arrived at the Harrison estate 5 years ago. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in child development, full of optimistic energy. The estate was breathtaking, a sprawling green oasis of old money and meticulous landscaping. Richard had been the one to interview me. He was kind, if a bit distracted, his mind clearly on the stock market tickers flashing on his phone. He spoke of wanting a stable, loving presence for his children, someone who would be part of the family. Eleanor had floated in at the end of the interview, all charm and dazzling smiles, smelling expensive perfume. She'd squeezed my arm and said, "The children are my entire world, we just want the best for them." It felt so genuine at the time. Now the memory of her words tasted like ash. The first few years had been good, genuinely good. Richard was gone more often than not, but he was always warm and appreciative when he was home. The children were my world. I potty trained Clara. I taught Leo how to read. We had our own little routines, our own inside jokes. We'd spend hours in the nursery, a bright sunny room on the second floor, that became our self-contained universe. It was the only room in the house that felt truly alive, filled with finger paintings, and mismatched socks, and the sound of laughter. The rest of the house was a museum, cold and silent, and perfect. The cracks in Eleanor's perfect facade had appeared slowly at first, then all at once. There was the time Clara, then 4, had come down with a raging fever. I'd called Eleanor, who was at a spa day with her friends. Her response, sighed into the phone, was, "Oh, she's always so dramatic, just give her some Tylenol." I ended up staying up with Clara all night, holding her, sponging her forehead, while her own mother slept soundly in her wing of the house. Another time, I'd spent weeks helping 10-year-old Leo prepare for the lead role in his school play. He was so proud, so nervous. The night of the performance, Eleanor had a last-minute dinner party she claimed she couldn't possibly get out of. She promised to make it up to him. She never did. I sat alone in that school auditorium, beaming with pride, my heart breaking for the little boy on stage, who kept scanning the audience for a face that would never appear. I became a buffer, a shield. I absorbed the small daily disappointments, so Leo and Clara wouldn't have to. I was the one who remembered parent-teacher conferences. I was the one who baked their birthday cakes from scratch, because Eleanor insisted on buying elaborate sculptural creations from a fancy bakery that the kids hated. I was their emotional center, and Eleanor resented me for it. My competence was a constant, unspoken indictment of her own maternal absence. She'd make little digs, always with a smile. She'd compliment a dress I was wearing, and then add, "I had something just like that from a thrift store in college." It was so much fun being poor. She'd introduce me to her friends as our miracle worker, a term that sounded like a compliment, but was designed to reinforce the gap between us. I was the staff. She was the madam of the manor. The affair with Julian, the landscaper, was just the final logical step in her long journey of self-interest. It wasn't about love or passion, it was about boredom. It was a distraction, a new exciting project, no different from redecorating the sunroom or planning a gala. I saw them. A stolen kiss behind the ancient oak tree, a hand lingering a little too long on an arm. It made my stomach turn, not for Richard's sake, he was a ghost in his own marriage, but for the instability it represented for the children. I chose to say nothing, bearing the knowledge deep inside. I told myself it was to protect Leo and Clara from the inevitable explosion. But if I'm being honest, I was also afraid. Afraid of her. Afraid of losing the only home, the only family I had. And that brought me back to the present. To the cold, hard floor of the nursery. The memory was so vivid, it was like I was there again. The security guard was waiting downstairs. I had 5 minutes left. I was doing one last, tearful scan of the room, my hand trailing along the familiar furniture. The rocking chair, where I'd soothed 1,000 fevers and nightmares. My fingers brushed against the worn wooden floorboards beneath it. One of them was loose. I'd noticed it before, but had always forgotten to mention it to the maintenance staff. On impulse, driven by a strange formless curiosity, I knelt down. I wedged my fingernails into the seam, and pulled. It came up easily, and there it was. Not a child's secret treasure, but an adult's. A slim black leather ledger, no bigger than a paperback book. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I knew instantly that this was something I shouldn't see. I looked over my shoulder, listening for the guard's footsteps. I had seconds. I snatched the book, shoved it deep into the bottom of my box under my sweaters, and replaced the floorboard. No one would ever know. Back in the motel room, I pulled it out. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely undo the simple elastic strap holding it shut. I opened it.
The first few pages confirmed my suspicions. It was a diary of sorts, detailing her affair with Julian, dates, places, disgustingly poetic descriptions of their trysts. It was damning, enough to obliterate her marriage and her reputation, but that was only the beginning. As I flipped further, the neat looping cursive turned to frantic blocky notes. There were names of banks I'd never heard of. Pictet, Lombard Odier. There were account numbers, long strings of digits and letters. There were notes about shell corporations, registered in the Cayman Islands, Panama, Liechtenstein, and next to them, figures. Numbers so large, they looked fake. Millions, tens of millions. It wasn't just her affair. It was the family's entire financial life, laid bare, a detailed step-by-step guide to a massive, illegal tax sheltering scheme. I sat back on the bed, the book open on my lap, my mind reeling. This was so much bigger than a stolen necklace. This was bigger than a sordid affair. This was a federal crime, on a colossal scale. Eleanor hadn't just hidden a diary, she'd hidden her entire family's fraudulent empire in the one place she never bothered to look: her own children's nursery. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. She thought the ledger was her secret weapon, her escape plan, or maybe even blackmail material, against Richard should he ever discover her infidelity. She had no idea it was about to become mine. I looked at the box of my life, the photo of the children, the cheap motel room. I thought of her face, so smug, and certain in her power. A cold resolve settled over me, pushing out the grief and the fear. It wasn't about revenge when I walked out that door, it was about heartbreak. But sitting there, with the proof of her rot and corruption in my hands, something shifted inside me. It wasn't about the money she had, or the life she lived. It was about the respect she had spat on. It was about the lie she had tried to make my reality, and in that moment, yes, it became about revenge.
The first few days were a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. The motel room, once a symbol of my despair, transformed into a makeshift headquarters. The ledger sat on the rickety nightstand, a black leather bomb waiting to be detonated. My first instinct, the one born of 5 years of trying to keep the Harrison family intact, was to just call Richard, to show him the book, to expose Eleanor for what she was, and hope he would do the right thing, clear my name, let me see the children, and handle his wife. But the more I thought about it, the more naive that seemed. I kept looking at the account numbers, the sheer scale of the operation. This wasn't just Eleanor's little secret, this was the Harrison family written all over it. Richard, with his constant international business trips and his army of accountants, couldn't possibly be ignorant of all of this. Maybe he didn't know the fine details, but willfully ignorant is still ignorant. Giving him the ledger would be like handing a lit match back to an arsonist and asking him to please be careful with it. He would bury it, he would protect the family name, the family fortune. He would thank me politely, maybe give me some hush money, and I would still be the nanny who was fired for theft. The official story would never change, and Eleanor would face no real consequences. No, that wasn't justice, that was just a tidier version of the same injustice. The system they had cheated had to be the system that held them accountable. It was the only way. My new sanctuary became the public library. The anonymity of it was comforting. Surrounded by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of old paper, I spent hours hunched over a public computer, my screen angled away from prying eyes. I typed in phrases that felt foreign and dangerous on my tongue. IRS whistleblower program, reporting offshore tax evasion, Form 211, application for award for original information. A whole new world opened up to me. I learned about the IRS's Office of the Whistleblower, a division specifically created to process tips from people like me. I learned that if the information led to a significant recovery of unpaid taxes, the whistleblower was entitled to a percentage of the amount collected. The numbers made me dizzy. The potential reward was life-altering, but in that moment the money was secondary. It was a pleasant fantasy, but the real prize was the power. The power to bypass Richard's denial and Eleanor's lies and go straight to the source. The power of the United States government. The process was daunting. It required meticulous documentation. I couldn't just send them the ledger. I had to build a case. I spent $10, a significant chunk of my dwindling cash, on a notebook and a pack of pens. I started transcribing. I cross-referenced the dates of her affair entries with Richard's travel schedule, which I knew by heart. I made notes on the corporate names, looking them up and finding they were nothing more than mail drops in Panama City. I was building a narrative, a timeline of greed and deceit. Then came the hardest part, making copies. The original ledger was my only leverage. I couldn't risk losing it. I found a 24-hour copy shop downtown and went in the middle of the night, my heart pounding with paranoia. I fed each page into the machine, my hands shaking. The cashier, a tired-looking young man with headphones on, didn't even glance at me. To him, I was just another person with a late-night project, but to me it felt like I was handling classified documents. I made 3 complete copies, one for the IRS, one to keep in a safe deposit box I planned to rent, and one for insurance. The original ledger I wrapped in plastic and hid at the very bottom of my suitcase. I knew I needed help, or at least someone to talk to. My own family was 1,000 miles away, and we weren't close. My friends from college had their own lives. The only person in the world who truly understood the dynamics of that house was Maria, the housekeeper. I found a payphone, a relic from another era, and dialed the Harrisons' back line, the one the staff used. I prayed she would be the one to answer. After 4 rings, her quiet, cautious voice came on the line. Harrison residence, Maria, it's me, it's Madison. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Madison, are you all right? Where are you? We have all been so worried. Her genuine concern almost made me break down right there. I'm okay. I lied. Maria, I need to see you, but it can't be at the house. It's important. She hesitated. I could hear the fear in her silence. Working for the Harrisons meant walking on a tightrope of loyalty. But Maria was a good person. She had always been kind to me, sneaking me snacks from the kitchen when I worked late, sharing a quiet, knowing look when Eleanor was on a particular rampage. There is a small park, by the church on Elm Street, she said finally, her voice low. Tomorrow, on my lunch break. 1 o'clock, the next day, sitting on a park bench under a large oak tree, I told her everything. I didn't show her the ledger, that felt too risky, but I told her what I had found. I watched her face as the story unfolded, her eyes growing wider and wider. She wasn't surprised by the affair, she'd long suspected, but the financial details shocked her. Dios mío, she whispered, crossing herself. I knew they were rich, but that is something else. That is a darkness I did not know. She told me the house had been a nightmare since I left. Eleanor was paranoid and volatile, snapping at everyone. She had apparently made a grand show of discovering her necklace in the pocket of a coat she'd forgotten she'd worn, claiming she must have put it there in a rush. The lie was so thin, so pathetic, but everyone was forced to play along. Richard was still in Singapore, oblivious. Leo and Clara were miserable. Leo was quiet and withdrawn, and Clara kept asking when I was coming back. Eleanor had told them I'd had a family emergency and had to leave suddenly, another lie in a house built of them. You are doing the right thing, Maria said, her hand finding mine. Her simple, heartfelt validation was like a drink of water in the desert. She cannot do this to people. She threw you away like you were nothing, but you are not nothing, Madison. You were the best thing in that house. She was my voice of reason, the external confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that my anger was justified. Her support solidified my resolve. Back in my motel room, I prepared the package. I filled out Form 211. I wrote a long, detailed cover letter, explaining who I was, how I had obtained the information, and why I was coming forward. I laid out the narrative of the affair, the timeline and the financial crimes, referencing specific page numbers in the enclosed photocopied ledger. I tried to sound as professional and credible as possible, not like a scorned, vengeful employee, but like a concerned citizen. It was a fine line to walk. My personal feelings were the fuel, but the facts had to be the engine. I put everything into a large manila envelope. I addressed it to the Internal Revenue Service, Office of the Whistleblower, in Washington, D.C. I held the thick, heavy envelope in my hands. It felt like the weight of my past, and the potential of my future all at once. There was no going back after this. I walked to the post office and paid extra for certified mail with a return receipt. As the postal worker stamped the envelope, and it disappeared behind the counter, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The bomb was no longer in my possession. The fuse was lit. It was out of my hands now. All I could do was wait for the explosion. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in patience and poverty. The money I'd had saved from my nanny salary dwindled at an alarming rate. The motel, once a temporary refuge, became a financial drain. I knew I had to get out, to find a job, to build some semblance of a normal life, while this silent, invisible war was being waged on my behalf. I checked out of the motel, put my few belongings into a storage unit, and found a tiny rundown studio apartment on the other side of town. It was a shoebox with peeling paint, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was mine. The first night I slept on an air mattress on the floor, I felt more at peace than I had in weeks. It was a new beginning, however humble. I found a job waiting tables at a greasy spoon diner called the Corner Booth. The work was grueling, the pay was minimum wage, plus tips, and my feet ached constantly. My uniform smelled of fried onions and stale coffee. It was a universe away from the perfumed air and silent halls of the Harrison estate, but there was an honesty to it that I found grounding. People were direct. They wanted coffee, you gave them coffee. They wanted eggs, you brought them eggs. There was no subtext, no hidden agenda, no psychological warfare. It was simple, it was real, and in a strange way, it was healing. Every day I'd come home to my tiny apartment and check the mail, my heart doing a little stutter step of anticipation. But for 2 solid months, there was nothing, just junk mail and bills. The silence from Washington was immense. I started to doubt myself. Had they received the package? Did they believe me? Was it just sitting in a massive slush pile of crank letters and conspiracy theories? The thought that I had gone through all of that for nothing was terrifying. Maria and I had a system. I'd call her from the payphone near the diner once a week. She was my only link to that other world. Anything? I'd ask. Nothing, Mira, she'd say. Everything is quiet, too quiet. Mr. Richard is back from his trip. He and the madam are tense. They walk around each other like strangers. The children miss you terribly. Hearing about Leo and Clara was a fresh stab of pain every time. I missed them so much. It was a physical ache. I missed Clara's goofy laugh, and Leo's serious, thoughtful questions. I had to remind myself, over and over, why I was doing this. It wasn't just for me, it was for them too. They deserved to be raised in a house built on something more stable than lies and stolen money. Then, one Tuesday, it's always a Tuesday, Maria's voice on the phone was different. It was tight, laced with a nervous energy. A letter came, she whispered. A very official letter, thick paper, from the Department of the Treasury. It wasn't for her, it was for the Harrison family office. Mr. Richard opened it. I was serving them lunch on the patio. I saw his face, Madison. It went gray, like stone. My heart started to pound against my ribs. What did it say? Did you see? I could not see the words, she said. But after he read it, he didn't speak for the rest of the meal. He just stared out at the garden. And she kept trying to ask him what was wrong, what the letter was about. He just waved his hand, told her it was business. But his eyes, Madison, his eyes were cold. Later I heard him on the phone with his lawyer. He was yelling. I heard the words asset reviews and unexplained flags. He is a man who is always in control. He is not in control anymore. This was it. The first tremor, the silent takeover had begun. It wasn't a dramatic raid with agents storming the mansion. It was quiet, bureaucratic. A single elegantly worded letter that had pierced their bubble of untouchability. The IRS wasn't accusing them of anything yet. They were just asking questions. But for people like the Harrisons, who operated in the comfortable shadows of their own wealth, the simple act of being seen, of being questioned, was a declaration of war. A week later, the second tremor hit. And this one was aimed directly at Eleanor. She called me. I was on my break at the diner, sitting in the alley behind the kitchen, when my cheap burner phone buzzed. It was a blocked number. I almost didn't answer. Hello, Madison, is that you? It was Eleanor's voice, but stripped of its usual authority. It was thin, reedy, and laced with a panic she was trying desperately to conceal. Eleanor, I said, my own voice flat and cold. Madison, we need to talk, she said, her words rushing out. There's been a misunderstanding about the necklace. I was overwrought. I wasn't thinking clearly. Of course you didn't take it. I was hoping we could put this all behind us. I said nothing. I just let her talk, listening to the frantic spin of her words. Richard is being difficult, she continued, her voice dropping. There are some financial complications. It's all very boring, but he's stressed, and he's taking it out on me. I think
I think you might have said something to him. About Julian. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. After everything, she still thought this was about her affair. She thought I had tattled to her husband, and that he was punishing her by freezing her allowance. The true scale of her predicament was so far beyond her comprehension, it was almost comical. She had no idea the tidal wave that was coming for her. She was worried about a leaky faucet, while her entire house was sliding into the sea. I have no idea what you're talking about, Eleanor, I said calmly. Don't lie to me, she shrieked, the mask of civility finally dropping. I know it was you. Richard is cutting me off. My credit cards are being declined. This is your fault. You're trying to ruin me because I fired you. Your credit cards being declined has nothing to do with me, I said, and it was the honest truth. I hadn't frozen her accounts. The United States government had. I can make this right, she said, her tone shifting abruptly from rage to pleading. I can give you money, a generous severance, $10,000. Is that what you want? Just tell Richard you were mistaken. Tell him you never saw anything. Please, Madison, you're ruining my life. $10,000. It was a fortune to me now, enough to solve all my immediate problems. A month ago, I might have been tempted, but not anymore. I had seen the numbers in her ledger. $10,000 was what she spent on a handbag. It was an insult. It was her trying to buy my silence, to reduce this whole epic betrayal to a simple transaction. I took a deep breath. It's not about money, Eleanor. It was never about the money. And then I did something that felt incredibly powerful. I hung up. I ended the call. I just pressed the button and silenced her. I sat there in the alley, the smell of grease in the air, and I smiled. The panic was beautiful. The silent, creeping bureaucratic takeover was working perfectly. They were turning on each other, consumed by paranoia and suspicion, and they still had no idea where the real attack was coming from. The power shift was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, grinding erosion. The Harrison empire, which had seemed so invincible, began to crumble from the inside out, corroded by the acid of the IRS investigation. Maria's weekly reports from the payphone became my own private drama series. The asset reviews had escalated into a full-blown audit. Men in suits, quiet and unnervingly polite, were now regular visitors at the Harrison estate, spending hours in Richard's study, poring over documents. The staff was instructed not to speak to them. The atmosphere in the house, Maria said, was like a tomb. The fatal blow to the marriage came, as I had suspected it would, not from a tearful confession, or a private investigator's grainy photo, but from a spreadsheet. The IRS, in its relentlessly methodical way, was tracing every dollar. They were untangling the web of shell corporations and offshore accounts, and in doing so, they inevitably stumbled upon the irregular payments, the wire transfers to a certain landscape architect named Julian, the purchase of a sports car, registered in his name, the down payment on a small apartment downtown. To the investigators, it was just a pattern of financial malfeasance, another way the family was hiding and spending untaxed money. They presented their findings to Richard and his legal team. As a matter of fact,
Maria overheard the aftermath. She said she'd never heard a sound like the one that came from the study that night. It wasn't yelling, it was a low, guttural roar of pure, undiluted rage. The family exodus had begun. Richard didn't just leave Eleanor, he evaporated from her life. One day he was there, a pillar of cold fury, the next his closets were empty, his cars were gone, and his lawyer had served her with divorce papers. The grounds were irreconcilable differences and gross financial misconduct, jeopardizing the marital estate. He had moved into a suite at the Four Seasons, taking his personal staff with him. He left Eleanor alone in that cavernous, silent mansion, with a skeleton crew of terrified employees and a mountain of legal bills. Her world had imploded. The source of her power, Richard's name, Richard's money, was gone. Her friends, the ones she lunched and gossiped with, suddenly stopped returning her calls. The whispers about the IRS audit and the divorce were swirling through their wealthy enclave. Eleanor Harrison, the queen bee of her social circle, had become toxic, and in her desperation, she turned to the only weapon she had left: her children. This was the part I had dreaded. She began her campaign of desperate counter-manipulation. She sat Leo and Clara down and spun a poisoned fairy tale. According to Maria, who'd overheard the tearful, one-sided conversation, Eleanor told them that Madison, their beloved Madison, was a wicked person. That I was a thief who had gotten angry about being fired and had told vicious lies to their father to break up the family. She painted me as the villain, the homewrecker who had destroyed their perfect life. She wept, she pleaded for their sympathy, she tried to leverage their love for me into hatred. Clara, at 7, was mostly confused and scared. She just cried and asked for her dad. But Leo was 10, on the cusp of understanding the complexities and hypocrisies of the adult world. He was quiet, he didn't cry, he just watched his mother with those old serious eyes of his. He had seen too much. He remembered the nights his mother was out at parties, while I was the one sitting by his bed. He remembered her dismissive tone, her casual cruelty. He remembered seeing her with Julian in the garden. He knew, in his gut, that her story didn't add up. A few days later, my burner phone rang. It was an unknown number, but it wasn't blocked like Eleanor's had been. I answered cautiously. Madison. The voice was small, hesitant. It took me a second to place it. Leo, is that you? Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I could hear him trying not to cry. I'm using Maria's phone. Mom doesn't know. My heart cracked open. Oh Leo, honey, are you okay? Mom said, she said you did bad things. She said you lied, and that's why Dad left. She said you stole from us. He paused, and I could hear him take a shaky breath. But I don't believe her. The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost buckled my knees. I leaned against the alley wall behind the diner, tears streaming down my face. She's lying, isn't she? He asked, his voice desperate for confirmation. You wouldn't do that, you wouldn't hurt us. No, Leo, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I would never ever hurt you, or Clara. Your mom is going through a hard time, and she's not thinking clearly. The things between her and your dad are complicated, but it's not your fault, and it's not my fault. I knew it, he whispered, and this time a small sob escaped. I miss you, Madison. I miss you too, sweetheart, I said, choking back my own tears. More than you'll ever know. You be strong, okay? For you and for your sister. Be strong. We talked for a few more minutes. He told me he and Clara were going to stay with their dad at the hotel that weekend. He promised to call again when he could. When I hung up the phone, I was crying, but not from sadness. It was a strange, fierce, protective joy. Eleanor had tried to poison their hearts against me, and she had failed. In her desperation, she had revealed her true self to her son, and he had seen right through her. That single secret phone call was a greater victory than any financial ruin I could bring down upon her. She had lost her money, she had lost her husband, and now she was losing her children. The power had well and truly shifted. Months passed. The legal machinery churned on, slow and implacable. The divorce was finalized. The IRS proceedings continued. The Harrison mansion, with its manicured gardens and cold, empty rooms, was put on the market, a casualty of the asset liquidation, required to begin paying back years of unpaid taxes and penalties. Eleanor, I heard through Maria, had moved into a small rented townhouse, a dramatic step down from her former life. Then one afternoon, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It's Eleanor. I need to see you, please. There's a cafe on 3rd and Main. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. I almost deleted it. What could there possibly be to say? But a morbid curiosity, and a sense that I needed one final face-to-face closing of this chapter, made me agree. I needed to see the aftermath of the storm I had created. The cafe was a neutral, anonymous place with bad art on the walls and the smell of burnt coffee in the air. I got there first and chose a small table in the corner. I watched her walk in. The change was shocking. The impeccable, intimidating Eleanor Harrison was gone. In her place was a woman who looked diminished. Her clothes, while still expensive, were rumpled. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She looked tired, she looked defeated. She sat down without a word, and fumbled in her purse for a moment before looking up at me. Her eyes, once so full of fire and contempt, were now just hollow. I hope you're happy, she said, her voice a brittle whisper. I just took a sip of my water, my hand perfectly steady. Happy isn't the word I'd use, Eleanor. You ruined me, she said, a flicker of her old self-pity surfacing. You took everything from me, my husband, my home, my friends, all because I fired you. Was it worth it? Was your pathetic little revenge worth all of this? I let her words hang in the air for a moment. I thought about the nights in the motel, the fear, the humiliation. I thought about the ache of missing the children. I thought about Leo's secret phone call. I looked her right in the eye, my gaze unwavering. You seem to be under a few misapprehensions, Eleanor, I said, my voice quiet, calm and devoid of the emotion she so clearly wanted to provoke. Let me clear them up for you. First, I didn't tell Richard about your affair with Julian. I never spoke a single word to him about it. The IRS found your little payments all on their own. It turns out, when you're investigating massive financial fraud, you tend to notice when someone is buying their pool boy a Porsche. Her face went pale. The idea that her downfall had been so impersonal, so bureaucratic, clearly horrified her. And second, I continued, leaning forward slightly, this wasn't about revenge for being fired. You're not that important. You accused me of stealing a necklace, a trinket worth a few $100,000, I suppose. And yes, you threw me out on the street without a second thought. But while you were concocting that petty little lie to cover your tracks, you were sitting on a secret. You were actively knowingly participating in the theft of tens of millions of dollars from the public trust. You see the imbalance there, don't you? You were so worried about me stealing a piece of jewelry that you never stopped to think that your entire kingdom was a house of cards, built on stolen money and criminal conspiracy. I let that sink in. She just stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. You called me the help, I said, the words tasting like victory. You said people like me get greedy. You have no idea what real greed looks like, Eleanor. It looks like you. It looks like a woman who has everything and is still willing to break the law for more. A woman who would risk her family's entire future for a cheap thrill, and then blame the nanny when it all comes crashing down. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I placed a $5 bill on the table for my water. You didn't just fire me, Eleanor. You underestimated me, and that was your fatal mistake. You thought I was just the help. But I was the one person in your entire life who was actually paying attention. I turned and walked out of the cafe without looking back. The air outside felt clean and fresh. The vindication wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet. It was the simple, profound satisfaction of speaking the unadorned truth to a person who had lived by lies. My old life was over. Her old life was over. But as I walked away, I knew with absolute certainty that my new reality was going to be infinitely better than hers. I was free. So where am I now? It's a question I ask myself sometimes, and the answer still feels a little like a dream. The IRS case against the Harrison family concluded about 6 months ago. The final tally of recovered taxes, fines and penalties was staggering, and as promised by the whistleblower program, a portion of that recovery was awarded to me. It was a sum of money, so large it felt like a typo at first. Life-changing doesn't even begin to cover it. For a while I was terrified of it. It felt like blood money, the proceeds of a life I had systematically dismantled. But then I thought about what that money really represented. It wasn't Eleanor's money, or Richard's. It was money that should have gone to building roads, funding schools, and supporting the very social fabric they had treated with such contempt. It was justice, converted into currency, and I decided I would use it for just that. It wasn't about revenge anymore, and it wasn't even about vindication. It was about building something new. I started a small foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal aid and temporary housing for domestic workers, nannies, housekeepers, caregivers, who are wrongfully terminated or exploited. I named it the Nursery Project, a little inside joke just for me. My new life is quiet. I have a modest home, a garden I tend to myself, and the profound peace that comes from no longer walking on eggshells. The Harrison family narrative ended as you might expect. Eleanor was left with a fraction of her former wealth after the divorce and the IRS settlement. She's facing potential criminal charges for her direct role in the fraud, though her lawyers are trying to paint her as a clueless, manipulated wife.
The irony is, that's the role she's always wanted to play, and now she gets to do it on a federal stage. Richard, humbled and stripped of his arrogance, is trying to rebuild. He's a smaller, quieter man now. The lion has been declawed, and the children, that's the part that is both the most painful and the most beautiful. Richard got primary custody. About a month after I walked out of that cafe, he called me. His voice was heavy with shame. He apologized. He apologized for his blindness, for allowing Eleanor's cruelty to fester in his home, for not protecting me, and for not protecting his own children from their mother's narcissism. It was a stilted, awkward conversation, but it was sincere. And then he asked the question I had been dreaming of hearing. He asked if I would be willing to see Leo and Clara again. It wasn't a job offer. It was a request. I'm not their nanny anymore. I'm just Madison. I see them every other weekend. We go to the park, we get ice cream, we build Lego castles on my living room floor. It's different now. The shadow of the estate is gone. Our relationship isn't defined by a contract or a salary. It's defined by genuine affection. It's a bittersweet reality, born from the ashes of a family, but it's real, and it's enough. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you this because for 5 years I let someone else define my worth. I accepted their narrative that I was just the help. I let their casual disrespect chip away at my own sense of self. And I know there are so many people out there, in all kinds of situations, in families, in jobs, in relationships, who feel invisible, who feel taken for granted. They say living well is the best revenge, but I've learned that's only half the truth. Sometimes you can't start living well until you've reclaimed your story. You have to burn down the rotten structure before you can build something new and clean in its place. Some fires you don't put out, you just walk away and let them burn. The truth has a power all its own, and you should never ever underestimate the quiet person in the corner. They're the one who's paying attention. I'm genuinely curious what you all think. Was going to the IRS a step too far? Or did Eleanor Harrison and the system she represented get exactly what they deserved? I'd love to read your take on it in the comments below. And if you've ever had a moment where you had to stand up and fight for your own dignity, please share that story too. We can all learn from each other's strength. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like, and consider subscribing for more stories in the future. Thank you for listening.